which is a personal hobby horse of mine, that there's one school of thought which would be that governments around the world like nothing more than to sign up for targets in the remote future. And 2030 is remote enough that you're never going to be held to account for what you sign up for. So what does it matter? And we set this very high bar, very very universal secondary by 2030. Some people would dispute that it's arithmetically attainable, let alone that it's politically attainable. And at the same time, we have these deep underlying inequalities, which are actually getting worse in many countries around the world in education. So do you think, is there a case for saying, if we're going to be serious about the universal agenda, we need a target which is nearer term, let's say in 5 years, which is about equity? That, in the process of getting to the universal goal, we're going to, in the next 5 years, halve the gap in school attendance between girls and boys, between rich and poor, learning outcomes in the 10 worst performing districts, the 10 best performing, or whatever. I mean, I guess the distilled version is, do you think there's a case for equity targets as part of the SDG framework?
Yes. No, I understand the question, and I do. Having been a politician, one of the cleft sticks in politics is voters are capable of saying in the same conversation, what the problem with politics is? You set all of these long-term targets, by 2050 Australia's going to be doing this, that and the other thing, and as you set them, you know that you're not going to be around to be held accountable for them. And then in the next breath, people will say, the problem with politics is people are only focused on the next election and no one plans for the longer term. And as a frustrated politician, you can say, gee, is there any way I get to win this conversation? Maybe I don't. I think one of the ways you can tell if a politician is serious about a long-term target is that they not only spell out the aim, the goal, but they actually lay out an implementation plan to get there. And even if they politically only survive for 3 years, 6 years, 10 years, whatever the political cycle in their nation tends to deliver to politicians, they can be held against the progress for the implementation plan. I think the world has to do that too. Otherwise, it's not going to be credible for people to just say there's this 2030 goal and somehow we're going to backload its implementation to the, canter, gallop between 2025 and 2030. We know what that looks like if you miss a target, because we're doing it now with universal access to primary school. And whilst people like Gordon Brown in his iteration as Special Envoy have been, pressing the case of let's, make the MDG on time, by the time he was asked to do that advocacy, it was basically impossible to reach the target on time. We're going to end up living through that cycle again unless we're very clear about the pathway. Now, that does mean we're probably going to have some complex and even unpleasant conversations about priority setting, because by definition, if you're going to set out a pathway, you're not doing everything at once. But I think the equity agenda, the girls' education agenda, in the global moment we have now, where so much attention is focused on the education of girls, I think if we could, set some real progress targets there and be seen to deliver them, then that would give people more confidence about the rest.
Thanks. Let's move on to gender. So in the book, you cite this really interesting piece of research, actually, where it's some brain function experiment, I don't remember, but where you make the point that the two first things our brain registers in personal interaction are race and gender. And then you make the follow-up point, which is profoundly important, actually, understated, that the fact that our brain works like that doesn't inform how we perceive gender. That's culturally determined, it's socially determined, and that these attitudes are very deeply ingrained. Now, when you look at the gender challenge in education, I think what we often do in the policy community, we look at the problem and then we say, okay, there's not enough girls in school, and especially if you're an economist, you'll say we need to shift the incentives by putting some more money or special scholarships for girls or something. But actually what you're often dealing with is very deeply ingrained social attitudes that believe girls' education isn't as important as boys' education. Your teachers who believe girls don't learn as fast as boys and that sort of stuff. And so I guess the question is, what do you think we need to bring to the table that's not there now, in terms of how we're looking at gender education and how we really shift the needle?
Yeah, I think, and I think this is the insight at the heart of CAMFED, the Campaign for Female Education, and what they've achieved through their model. We've got to be as clear as we can, working in individual communities, whether the barrier is poverty, economic opportunity for a family, culture, or how those things mix in together. And what CAMFED has shown through its work is that if you can address the poverty that is keeping girls out of school, if you can explain the economic proposition to families about why it's important to educate girls, then the cultural barrier about doing so will fall away. Now, that doesn't mean that for every community that would be the unlocking key, but it's clearly been the unlocking key for a number of communities that CAMFED works in. And I mean, all of that reminds me, Anthony Giddens, who used to write about these things, one of the things he tracked in our attitude to children, our own nation's attitude to children, is it's not that many generations ago that children were viewed by families in our own nations as economic benefits. It was good to have a lot of kids. It's good to have a lot of kids because you could send them out to do things that mattered, like work on the land or go and get income in various ways that supported very poor family units. In our societies now, we've moved from that view of children as economic contributors to the family to the sort of iteration of the prized child, where children. Anybody who's had a child will talk about the costs of having a child, not the income earning possibilities that having the child has brought them. Particularly given with all of the things that we want our children to have today. But in many poor places where people are, struggling for sufficient food to live and the like, if the economic proposition is we can only live with our girl children doing agricultural labour, doing labour at home to free up adults to go and do income earning activities, to take goods to market. If we can only live with our girl child doing those things, then that is what she will do. If you can change that proposition so that ultimately you and the family will live better, if that girl gets the opportunity to go to school, get skills and capabilities, have a better income earning life, have the wherewithal, as we know education does for women, to enable her to make more choices about her own life, when she'll marry, how she will deal with her own fertility and her own having of children. This is a virtuous circle for you and your family. If we can get that proposition through, then I think a lot of the sort of cultural barriers will fall away. So I think that's the important conversation, and it does mean you've got to react in communities as you find them. You can't steamroller out of the GPE Secretariat in Washington or London or wherever it may be with a set of predispositions. You've got to take communities through the conversation.
Yeah. Let's move on to the conflict and humanitarian emergency agenda. I think the figures are now that something like 40% of kids who are out of school, primary school age kids who are out of school, are living in conflict-affected or post-conflict countries. And I guess one of the great reversals that we've had in education recently, actually probably in the last 100 years, is Syria.
Yes.
Which has gone from education indicators up there with Malaysia to education indicators down there with South Sudan in the space of a single generation. And the international response by and large, has not been that encouraging. You know, very small amounts of money delivered on a intermittent
Yes.
basis. And we clearly lack the architecture that we need to cater for those kids and to support those kids. And if we don't get that right, then I guess all bets are on the SDGs are off, aren't they? So what's your take on how we can make the architecture more robust and effective?
Yes. My take on it is this is a complex picture, and I know the ODI work shows that it's a complex picture, and for people who love a good cluster or acronym for an agency that's involved in humanitarian work or crisis response, reading your way through the ODI work about the current humanitarian architecture will certainly fill you with that. But if you take the step back from the immediate mosaic of pieces that come together when a humanitarian emergency starts to respond, I think where we are is, there is a first instance response to a humanitarian crisis that does embed in it some education work. But as the crisis persists and becomes the new normal, people aren't going back anytime soon to what their life was going to be, then it kind of falls in a hole and there's this big gap. Over time, there might emerge a long-term development agenda for the new normal. But by the time the gap has been lived through, that gap is sufficient to be the lives of at least one generation of children and potentially a number of generations of children. And so how do we better respond to that gap? And that gap, I think, challenges our thinking in a series of ways. It's not necessarily going to be about children in the poorest places on earth. Syria, people have fled to middle-income countries, but by the pressure of their very presence have made an impact on education and the livelihood of those countries. You look at the intensity of the number of Syrian refugees in Lebanon, of course it would change a country. But for the donor community that normally looks for the categorisations of countries, your mind doesn't run to support for middle income countries. What's the genesis of the new normal look like? I mean, in Lebanon that's been the double shifting of schools. That's a very useful, immediate response, but over time it can't be the durable response. So how do you move from that immediate response to the durable response? I think we are learning a whole lot from the Syrian crisis, which means that, not that we would be hoping for a next time, but given the nature of our world, there will inevitably be a flare-up that gives us a next time. I think we are learning a whole lot of things, which means we could have some architecture and some funding structures that, having learnt from this, could swing in quite quickly. Complicated but doable, and I hope through the journey of this year that we do globally resolve to do it. And it requires a new, to newly integrate humanitarian and development work when in so many nations around the world, agencies, donors, these things are pretty siloed. We're going to have to, think about that architecture very precisely, but I'm sure it can be done.
Okay, thanks, Julia. There was one more question I wanted to ask you, but I think it's going to come up in the general discussion, which is on aid, actually.
Sure.
That because I think there is a sense in education that we're raising the bar on ambition, but that we're very much the poor cousin of, by comparison with health, in terms of, what's going on in terms of aid behind the commitment is not entirely encouraging. And I know is through GPE that's a discussion you're very actively involved in, but I'm 99% confident that's going to come up in the discussion.
Sure.
So